"Why are you still renting that tiny place, Eve?" my brother Robert asked, his voice carrying across the polished marble floor as if he had just announced a toast instead of a question that would quietly fracture the foundation of everything I believed about my life. The chatter in the mansion's grand foyer softened, like music turned down in another room. I stared at him, unsure whether I had misheard. The crystal chandelier above us scattered warm light across the faces of relatives I had not seen in years, their smiles frozen in polite curiosity. I had been invited here for a family gathering, a vague celebration Daniel insisted would lift my spirits. At 71, I had learned that surprises rarely did. "Renting," I repeated, my voice thinner than I intended. "What do you mean?" Robert frowned, confusion knitting his silver brows together. "The mansion you and Harold bought. Don't tell me you finally sold it without telling anyone." A ripple of uncomfortable laughter moved through the room, quickly dying when it became clear no one else understood the joke either. My son Daniel shifted beside his wife Victoria near the sweeping staircase. He adjusted the cuff of his tailored navy suit, the one I knew cost more than my monthly expenses. Victoria's hand tightened around the stem of her champagne flute. She did not sip. She only watched me. I felt something inside my chest go very still. Harold and I had spent 37 years building a life brick by brick, saving carefully, dreaming carefully, loving carefully. A mansion was not a word we ever used. We had talked about a lake house once, on a road trip through North Carolina, when the dogwoods were blooming and we still believed time would stretch out forever. But he died before any of those plans could become real. After his funeral, the world had shrunk to the size of my one-bedroom rental on Maple Street. 800 square feet. Beige carpets. A refrigerator that hummed like it was thinking too hard. I had told myself simplicity was a virtue. I had told myself Daniel was busy. I had told myself many things. "Mom, Uncle Rob's just confused," Daniel said lightly, though his smile arrived half a second too late. "You know how real estate talk gets mixed up." He placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder. Felt like a performance. I nodded because that was what I had always done. Nodded when life was kind. Nodded when it was not. Around us, the mansion gleamed with a kind of effortless wealth that made my palms damp. The air smelled faintly of lemon polish and fresh peonies. Through the tall arched windows I could see manicured lawns stretching toward a line of oak trees like something from a magazine spread. I wondered, suddenly and irrationally, what it would feel like to wake up here. To walk barefoot across floors that never creaked. To open a closet without calculating what to give away. Victoria stepped closer, her heels clicking softly. "You must be tired, Evelyn," she said, her voice smooth as satin. "These big events can be overwhelming." She was younger than Daniel by 5 years but carried herself like someone who had always expected the world to rearrange itself for her comfort. I searched her face for warmth and found only precision. Robert looked between us, unsettled now. "I'm sorry if I spoke out of turn," he said. "I just assumed, well, Harold was so proud of that place. He told me about the closing over dinner. Said it would be your forever home." Forever. The word lingered in the air like a ghost no one wanted to acknowledge. My fingers tightened around my purse strap. I could feel my heartbeat there, steady and insistent, as if reminding me I was still present in a conversation about my own life. Daniel cleared his throat. "Uncle Rob, you must be thinking of another property Harold looked at. Nothing ever went through." His tone was calm, practiced. Too practiced. I turned to him then, really turned, studying the man I had raised. The boy who once built me a crooked birdhouse in 4th grade. The teenager who used to fall asleep during Sunday movies with his head in my lap. Somewhere along the way, he had become a stranger fluent in explanations. "Maybe," I said quietly. It was easier than arguing. Easier than admitting I did not know which memories were mine anymore, and which had been gently rewritten without my permission. Music resumed in the next room. Someone laughed too loudly. Victoria finally took a sip of her champagne. The moment dissolved, as moments do, into polite conversation and clinking glasses. But something had already shifted. A small crack had appeared in the careful story I had been telling myself since Harold died. And for the first time in 3 years I realized there might be chapters one had never been allowed to read. That night I returned to my apartment on Maple Street long after the mansion lights had faded behind me like a dream that refused to follow me home. The hallway smelled faintly of detergent and something fried from a neighbor's dinner. I unlocked my door and stepped into the quiet that had become both my refuge and my punishment. 800 square feet. Beige carpet worn thin near the sofa. A small kitchen counter cluttered with unopened mail, and a ceramic mug I had not had the energy to wash that morning. I set my purse down carefully, as if sudden movements might cause the fragile thoughts inside my mind to scatter beyond recovery. Robert's question replayed again and again, his voice steady and sincere. He had not sounded confused. He had sounded certain. I walked to the window and parted the blinds. Across the parking lot, a flickering streetlight painted everything in tired shades of yellow. Harold used to fix things like that without being asked. He believed small problems were invitations to care. I sat at the kitchen table and began opening the envelopes one by one. Bills first, always bills. Electricity. Insurance. A reminder from the pharmacy about my prescription refill. The numbers had become familiar companions, each one quietly measuring the limits of my independence. Daniel had offered help after the funeral. He had said, "You just focus on healing, Mom. I will handle the complicated stuff." I had believed him because belief felt easier than learning to fight. I rose and crossed the living room, running my hand along the back of the sofa Harold and I had bought during our last anniversary sale together. It was too large for the space, but I had refused to part with it. Some memories demanded physical proof. My reflection in the dark television screen startled me. Silver hair pinned neatly, shoulders still straight despite the years. Eyes that had once been described as hopeful. I wondered when hope had begun to resemble habit instead. The idea of a mansion pressed against my thoughts like a door I had never noticed before. Had there been paperwork I signed without reading carefully? Meetings I attended in a haze of grief where decisions slipped past me like passing traffic? I moved to the small filing cabinet beside the bookshelf and pulled open the bottom drawer. Inside, folders rested in careful rows, labeled in Harold's handwriting. Property taxes, retirement accounts, warranties for appliances we no longer owned. His penmanship had always been precise, almost formal, as if he believed clarity could protect us from uncertainty. I sat on the floor and began to sort through them, the clock on the microwave ticking forward with quiet determination. Midnight came and went. Outside, a car door slammed. Somewhere down the hall, a television laughed at something I could not hear. My fingers paused on an envelope thicker than the rest, sealed with an unfamiliar bank logo. I did not remember receiving it. I did not remember much from those first months after Harold's passing, only a blur of condolences and casseroles and Daniel's steady voice guiding me through what he called necessary transitions. I held the envelope up to the lamp. The paper inside cast a faint shadow like a secret trying to breathe. For a long moment I did nothing. Then I set it back in the drawer and closed it gently. Some truths required more strength than I possessed at 2 in the morning. Instead, I poured myself a glass of water and stood by the sink, listening to the hum of the refrigerator. I thought about the mansion's marble floors, the way Victoria had watched me as if measuring something invisible. I thought about Harold describing a forever home over dinner with my brother. Most of all, I thought about the careful way Daniel had smiled. A realization began to settle over me, not loud or dramatic, but steady as the ticking clock. My life had been moving forward on a path I did not remember choosing. And if there was a door I had been kept from opening, I knew now that I would have to find the courage to turn the handle myself. Morning arrived without ceremony, slipping through the thin blinds and pale stripes that settled across my kitchen table like quiet accusations. I had slept very little. The unopened envelope lingered in my thoughts the way a distant siren lingers even after the sound has faded. I brewed coffee and watched the steam rise, remembering how Harold used to insist that the first cup of the day set the tone for everything that followed. He believed in rituals. He believed in preparation. I had believed in him. After breakfast, I dressed carefully in the navy cardigan he once said made me look decisive, a word that felt foreign on my shoulders now. I told myself I would simply run errands, pick up my prescription, maybe stop by the grocery store for fresh fruit. Ordinary plans for an ordinary widow. Yet by the time I reached the pharmacy, the idea of ordinary had begun to dissolve. The young cashier handed me my medication with a polite smile that did not quite reach her eyes. The total blinked on the screen. I hesitated, calculating whether I could wait another week. Then I remembered the marble floors and Victoria's measured gaze, and I slid my debit card through the reader without another thought. Outside, the late autumn air carried the sharp scent of fallen leaves. I sat in my car for several minutes, hands resting on the steering wheel, watching people hurry past with lives that seemed firmly anchored. A question formed, quiet but persistent. If Harold had truly planned something more for me, why had I never seen the evidence? That afternoon I returned home with groceries I did not remember choosing. Apples, bread, a carton of milk nearing its expiration date. I placed them in the refrigerator and stood there longer than necessary, listening again to the familiar hum. Then, with a steadiness that surprised me, I walked to the filing cabinet and opened the bottom drawer. The thick envelope waited exactly where I had left it, patient as time itself. I sat at the table, smoothed the paper flat, and broke the seal. Inside were copies of documents stamped with official logos and dates from 3 years earlier, the month Harold passed away. Property transfer confirmations, bank correspondence, a typed letter addressed to me, explaining that certain assets had been consolidated for ease of management. My name appeared again and again, but so did Daniel's. My son had signed as co-administrator. I read each page slowly, tracing the lines with my finger as if they might rearrange themselves into a different truth. Somewhere in the language of percentages and account numbers was the outline of a life I had not been living. My phone rang, startling me. Daniel's name glowed on the screen. For a moment I considered letting it go to voicemail. Instead I answered. His voice was warm, practiced. He asked about my health, about the weather, about whether I had enjoyed the gathering. I responded in kind, matching his tone word for word. When he mentioned a new investment opportunity he thought I might appreciate, I felt something inside me settle into place. Not anger. Not grief. Something cooler. Something clearer. After we hung up, I folded the documents neatly and returned them to the envelope. I did not cry. I did not pace the room or call Robert in a panic. I simply washed my coffee mug, wiped down the counter, and made a list on the back of a grocery receipt. Names. Dates. Questions. Outside, the streetlight flickered on again though the sun had not fully set. I realized then that whatever had been decided for me without my knowledge was only the beginning of the story. And for the first time since Harold's funeral, I felt the faint but unmistakable stirrings of resolve. I woke before dawn the next morning with a clarity that felt almost unfamiliar. As if someone had quietly replaced the fragile woman I had been with someone who understood that survival sometimes required observation more than emotion. The envelope rested on the kitchen table exactly where I had left it, a silent witness to the careful shift happening inside me. I made oatmeal the way Harold used to like it, with a drizzle of honey and a sprinkle of cinnamon, even though I had no appetite. Routine steadied my hands. After breakfast I opened my notebook and began writing down everything I could remember from the months after his passing. Conversations blurred by grief. Meetings Daniel had insisted were urgent. Documents he had placed before me with gentle reassurances. I remembered sitting in a conference room that smelled faintly of leather and printer ink, while a man in a gray suit explained something about streamlining accounts. I had nodded, trusting my son's calm presence more than the words themselves. Now those memories returned with sharper edges. I could see Victoria in the doorway that day, smiling in a way that seemed supportive but distant, as if she were already part of a plan I had not been invited to understand. The realization did not bring anger. Brought focus. I decided to visit the bank branch listed on one of the letters. The building stood on a busy corner downtown, its glass exterior reflecting a sky that threatened rain. Inside, everything was quiet and climate-controlled, the kind of silence money often buys. A young associate led me to a small office where a manager with kind eyes listened as I explained I needed clarification about several accounts. He pulled up records on his screen, his expression shifting from professional neutrality to polite concern. He confirmed that certain properties had indeed been transferred into a trust structure shortly after Harold's death. My signature was there, perfectly legal. Daniel had been named primary decision-maker in the event that I felt overwhelmed. I smiled at the irony. Overwhelmed had been the one thing I had not been allowed to show. Walking back to my car, I felt the first drops of rain on my face, cool and steady. The city moved around me with its usual urgency, unaware that a quiet unraveling had begun in the life of a woman most people would never notice. That afternoon Daniel called again, suggesting we meet for dinner later in the week. His tone was affectionate, almost eager. I agreed without hesitation. If he sensed any change in me, he did not mention it. I spent the evening organizing the paperwork into new folders, labeling them in my own handwriting this time. Property, transfers, trust clauses, questions for the attorney whose name appeared at the bottom of several pages. I placed them neatly inside my tote bag, feeling the weight as both burden and promise. Outside, the rain intensified, drumming softly against the window as if marking the passage of time. I sat in my armchair and allowed myself one brief memory of Harold's laughter, the way it used to fill our home and make every decision seem less frightening. Then I set the memory aside with care. The future, I understood now, would not be shaped by what I had lost, but by what I chose to uncover. And somewhere between the flicker of the streetlight and the steady rhythm of the storm, I realized I was no longer simply enduring my days. I was preparing. I chose a quiet Italian restaurant on the edge of downtown for dinner with Daniel, the kind of place where the lighting is soft enough to flatter everyone and the music is just loud enough to blur uncomfortable pauses. I arrived 10 minutes early and asked for a table near the window. From there I could watch the steady flow of traffic and remind myself that the world did not revolve around one family's secrets. When Daniel walked in, he looked every bit the successful man he had become. His charcoal overcoat fit perfectly. His hair was trimmed with careful precision. He hugged me warmly, as if affection were something that could be scheduled between meetings. Victoria followed a step behind, elegant in a cream-colored dress that seemed chosen to reflect the candlelight. She kissed my cheek and asked how I had been feeling, her concern smooth and rehearsed. We ordered dinner. Pasta for me, steak for Daniel, a glass of sparkling water for Victoria. Conversation began with harmless topics. Weather patterns, rising grocery prices, a neighbor who had recently sold her house. I listened more than I spoke, noticing how Daniel's eyes flicked toward his phone whenever it buzzed against the table. Not urgency, habit. When the waiter refilled our glasses, I mentioned the bank visit as casually as possible. Daniel's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. He explained again how complicated financial planning could be, how he had only wanted to protect me from unnecessary stress. His words were gentle. His tone was patient. Victoria nodded in agreement, adding that modern asset management required quick decisions that older generations sometimes found overwhelming. I thanked them both for their care. It was important to let them believe I remained exactly who they thought I was. Dessert menus arrived. Daniel suggested we celebrate an upcoming investment opportunity he had been considering on my behalf. I asked a few careful questions, watching how he chose his answers. Each one felt like a stone placed deliberately across a river I was meant to cross without looking down. At one point Victoria mentioned the mansion in passing, referring to it as a property that required constant upkeep. She spoke as though she had always lived with its responsibilities. When she realized what she had said, she laughed lightly and changed the subject to travel plans. The moment lingered between us like the scent of extinguished candles. I finished my coffee slowly, allowing silence to stretch just enough to become noticeable. Daniel reached for the check, insisting as always. Outside, the night air carried a hint of winter. We stood on the sidewalk beneath a street lamp that cast long shadows behind us. He asked if I needed help with anything at the apartment. I told him I was managing just fine. That word again. Managing. It had become the quiet measure of my dignity. After they drove away, I remained there for a moment, watching their taillights disappear into traffic. The realization that had been forming over the past few days now felt solid, almost tangible. I was no longer reacting to events. I was gathering them. Each conversation, each misplaced confidence, each carefully chosen omission. Back home, I spread the documents across my kitchen table like pieces of a puzzle I was finally willing to solve. A name at the bottom of one page caught my attention again. Harold's attorney. Someone who might remember promises made before grief blurred the details. I wrote down his number in my notebook, pressing the pen hard enough to leave an imprint on the page beneath. The refrigerator hummed. The streetlight flickered. Somewhere in the distance, A train whistle echoed through the night. I realized then that preparation was no longer an abstract idea. It was a path I had already begun to walk. I dialed the number just after 9 the next morning, my hand steady despite the faint tremor that had once followed every decision involving lawyers and paperwork. The office of Martin Reynolds had not changed in 3 years. His assistant still answered with the same composed warmth, as if time inside those walls moved at a slower, more deliberate pace. When he came on the line, his voice carried a quiet recognition that unsettled me more than surprise would have. He remembered Harold. He remembered the night they finalized certain arrangements over black coffee, and a stack of documents neither of them had expected to become urgent so soon. We agreed to meet that afternoon. The drive downtown felt different this time. Not like a reluctant errand but like a deliberate step toward something I could no longer pretend did not exist. Martin's office overlooked the river, wide windows framing water that moved with calm authority. He stood as I entered, offering both hands in greeting. Age had added silver to his temples but not softened the sharp intelligence in his eyes. We spoke first about Harold, about small memories that steadied the room before business began. Then I placed the envelope on his desk and watched as he opened it with practiced care. His expression shifted almost imperceptibly as he read. He asked precise questions. Had Daniel explained the trust structure fully? Had I been present for every signature? Had I felt pressured in any way? I answered honestly, aware that truth did not require dramatics. It only required clarity. Martin leaned back in his chair, folding his glasses in one measured motion. He explained that Harold had indeed purchased a property shortly before his passing. Not as a luxury but as an investment meant to secure my future independence. The trust had been designed to simplify management, yes, but also to ensure that ultimate control would revert to me under specific conditions. Conditions that required my awareness and my consent. I felt the weight of those words settle into place like the final piece of a long-ignored map. For the first time since Robert's question in that marble foyer, I understood that what had been presented as protection might also have been limitation. Martin slid a separate document across the desk. A clause handwritten by Harold himself, witnessed and notarized. It stated clearly that any decision made on my behalf without full disclosure could be legally challenged. The room grew very quiet. Outside, sunlight fractured across the river in bright, indifferent patterns. I realized then that grief had not only taken my husband, it had taken my authority. Martin asked what I wanted to do next. The answer surprised me with its simplicity. I wanted time. Time to gather more information. Time to allow Daniel and Victoria to continue believing their version of events remained intact. Strategy I was learning often began with patience. We discussed practical steps. Reviewing property records. Requesting financial statements. Setting boundaries that could not be easily dismissed as confusion. When I left his office, the afternoon air felt sharper, cleaner. I walked slowly along the riverfront, watching leaves drift across the water like quiet reminders that change did not always announce itself with noise. By the time I reached my car, resolve had replaced uncertainty entirely. That evening I called Daniel and suggested we host a small family dinner at the apartment later in the week. His enthusiasm was immediate, almost relieved. Victoria sent a message moments later offering to bring dessert. I smiled as I placed my phone face down on the table. Preparation was no longer a solitary act. It was becoming an invitation. The day of the dinner arrived with a quiet sense of inevitability, like the slow turning of a season that no one notices until the leaves are already on the ground. I spent the morning preparing dishes Daniel had loved since childhood. Roasted chicken with rosemary. Mashed potatoes with just enough butter to remind him of Sundays that once felt uncomplicated. Cooking steadied my thoughts, each measured cup and careful stir reinforcing the discipline I had come to rely on. By late afternoon the apartment carried the warm scent of familiarity, a stark contrast to the polished grandeur of the mansion that still lingered at the edges of my memory. I set the table with my best china, the one Harold insisted we save for special occasions. Tonight I decided was one. When the doorbell rang, I took a breath and opened it with a smile I had practiced in the mirror. Daniel stepped inside first, holding a bottle of wine he claimed a client had recommended. Victoria followed with a neatly boxed dessert tied in a pale ribbon, her eyes sweeping the room in a quick, assessing glance. She complimented the arrangement of the flowers on the table, as though noting improvements rather than sharing admiration. We sat down together, the clink of silverware filling the spaces between polite conversation. Daniel spoke about new projects. Victoria mentioned an upcoming charity event. I listened, nodding at the right moments, allowing them to guide the rhythm of the evening. At one point Daniel asked whether I had considered moving somewhere more convenient, perhaps closer to them. The suggestion was framed as concern as practicality. I responded thoughtfully, explaining that independence had become important to me. His expression softened, but I saw the flicker of calculation behind it. Halfway through dinner I rose to refill our glasses and deliberately left my notebook open on the counter where it could be seen. Lists of numbers. Names of banks. The attorney's contact information. Victoria noticed first. Her voice faltered for a fraction of a second before she asked casually whether I had taken up bookkeeping as a hobby. I laughed gently and said I was simply trying to stay organized. Organization, after all, was something no one could object to. The rest of the meal unfolded with increasing caution. Daniel chose his words more carefully. Victoria's questions grew lighter, almost overly cheerful. It was like watching actors adjust their performance mid-scene. After dessert, I suggested we move to the living room for coffee. I brought out a folder and placed it on the table without opening it. No acquiescence. No dramatic revelations. Just the quiet presence of possibility. Daniel leaned back in his chair, studying me as though seeing a new version of his mother for the first time. Victoria crossed her legs, her posture elegant but alert. We spoke about Harold then, about memories that felt both genuine and strategic. I described how he had always believed in preparing for the unexpected. Daniel agreed, his voice careful. Outside, the streetlight flickered to life, casting long shadows across the carpet. I realized that what mattered most was not what I said but what I allowed them to imagine. When they finally left, promising to call soon, I closed the door with a calm I had not known in years. The apartment seemed quieter than before, but not emptier. On the table, the unopened folder waited like a promise I was no longer afraid to keep. I did not sleep much after that dinner. Not because of fear, but because my mind had begun arranging pieces with a clarity that felt almost surgical. Morning sunlight slid across the kitchen floor in thin golden lines, revealing dust I had ignored for weeks and possibilities I had ignored for years. I made coffee and sat with the unopened folder in front of me, turning it slowly as if feeling its weight could teach me something words could not. By noon I had already called Martin Reynolds and confirmed what we both understood without needing to say it directly. The next step would not be loud. It would be precise. That afternoon I took a bus across town to the county records office, a place where history lived quietly in metal cabinets and fluorescent light. A clerk with kind eyes helped me locate property filings tied to Harold's name. Page after page confirmed what I had begun to suspect. The mansion existed. The purchase date matched the week Harold had returned from that dinner with Robert. The transfer into the trust had been completed just days after his funeral. My signature appeared again, small and steady like a ghost of obedience. I copied everything carefully, placing each document into my tote bag with deliberate care. Outside, the sky had turned a pale winter blue. I walked slowly along the sidewalk, aware of how ordinary the world still looked. People carried shopping bags. A child laughed somewhere near the bus stop. Life rarely paused to acknowledge the quiet revolutions happening inside strangers. That evening Daniel called, his voice unusually attentive. He asked if I would join them at the mansion over the weekend. He said they were hosting a small gathering and thought it might be good for me to see the place properly. The invitation felt less like generosity and more like reassurance offered to themselves. I accepted. When Saturday arrived, Victoria greeted me at the tall front doors with a smile that did not reach her eyes. Inside, the house glowed with curated perfection. Fresh flowers. Soft music. Guests who spoke in lowered tones about market trends and vacation plans. Daniel introduced me as though unveiling a cherished heirloom. I moved through the rooms with measured calm, noting the details he hoped I would admire. The sweeping staircase. The sunroom overlooking the manicured lawn. A study that still smelled faintly of new leather. At one point I paused beside a framed architectural rendering hanging near the hallway. Harold's handwriting marked the margin in blue ink. His small hopeful script. Victoria appeared beside me, her voice light. She mentioned how much responsibility the property required, how grateful they were to manage it for me. I nodded, allowing gratitude to be the language she expected. Later, as the evening thinned and guests began to leave, Daniel led me onto the terrace where string lights flickered against the darkening sky. He spoke about the future, about consolidating assets, about making sure I never had to worry again. I listened, feeling the documents in my bag like a quiet pulse. When he finished, I thanked him for his concern and told him I would be meeting with the attorney next week to review Harold's original intentions. The silence that followed was almost beautiful. Victoria's expression froze in polite surprise. Daniel's smile faltered, then reformed into something cautious. In that moment I understood that the performance had shifted. Not dramatically, not irreversibly, just enough to reveal that the stage no longer belonged entirely to them. As I drove home beneath a sky scattered with cold stars, I realized that truth had finally stepped into the light, and I was no longer afraid to stand beside it. The meeting with Martin Reynolds was scheduled for 10 o'clock on a clear Monday morning that felt strangely lighter than any day I had lived through since Harold's passing. I dressed with care, choosing a soft gray coat he had once said made me look composed even when life was not. The river outside Martin's office reflected the winter sun in bright fragments that reminded me how truth often arrives in pieces before it becomes whole. Inside, the conversation moved quickly. Documents were reviewed. Clauses were explained. Authority that had quietly slipped away from me years ago was now outlined in firm legal language that could no longer be ignored or reinterpreted. Martin spoke with measured certainty about my rights, about the intention Harold had written in his own hand, about the difference between assistance and control. I listened without interruption, feeling something inside me settle into place like a door finally closing against the cold. By noon, decisions had been made. Notices would be prepared. Financial access would be restructured. Ownership would return to its rightful course. There was no drama in the process, only signatures and steady voices and the faint scratch of a pen across paper. When I left the office, I did not rush home. Instead, I drove to the edge of the lake Harold and I had once visited during a spring that now felt like another lifetime. The water lay calm beneath a pale sky, its surface untroubled by the quiet changes unfolding in my world. I sat in the car for a long time, remembering how he had spoken about building a future that would protect me even when he could not. For the first time, I understood that protection was never meant to replace my own strength. Later that week, Daniel called, his tone carefully neutral. He said he had received correspondence from the attorney and wanted to discuss next steps. We met at a small cafe halfway between his office and my apartment. Victoria joined us, her elegance intact but her confidence slightly dimmed, like a lamp turned down. They spoke about misunderstandings, about how complicated grief had been for everyone. I listened, allowing them the dignity of explanation. When they finished, I explained calmly that the mansion would be placed on the market. The proceeds would fund a life I would choose for myself. Silence settled over the table, thick but not hostile. Daniel nodded slowly, perhaps realizing that the quiet woman he had once guided through decisions was now guiding herself. Victoria reached for her cup, her hand steady but her eyes thoughtful. We parted without raised voices or accusations, only the clear understanding that roles had shifted in ways none of us could undo. A month later, I stood on the porch of a modest lakeside cottage with white siding and wide windows that welcomed the morning sun. The air smelled of pine and possibility. Movers carried in boxes labeled with careful handwriting that was entirely my own. Inside, the rooms echoed gently, waiting to be filled with new routines and memories that would belong solely to me. I placed Harold's photograph on the mantel and opened the windows to let fresh air sweep through the space. Somewhere across the water, a boat engine hummed, steady and purposeful. I realized then that loss had not ended my story. It had only hidden the path I was meant to find. And as I stepped out onto the dock, feeling the solid wood beneath my feet and the quiet strength of my own resolve, I understood that the future was finally, unmistakably mine.